Hi, I'm Eddie Malesky. I'm the director of the Duke University Center for International Development, and I'm a long-term consultant on the PAPI project. I specifically deal with statistics and methodology. While the other speakers have talked a lot about the overall findings and the specific findings for each province, I'm going to talk about three separate research projects today that have some really interesting findings that we want to share with you that have big implications, not just for policymaking in Vietnam at the central and local level, but also for how we think about the results of the PAPI survey. In particular, I want to talk today about internal migration and how migrants are received in the recipient province, where they end up going, and especially how their experience impacts how we should understand PAPI results. And second, because this is election season and we're all in the process of making choices about who people are going to vote for candidates and what the impact will be on the National Assembly, I want to talk a little bit about a project to analyze how people vote and who they vote for and how gender impacts those results. So let's deal first with the internal migration and governance project. Now here, in particular, I want to start off by talking about a pilot study that we did that looked at a little bit different. How would the PAPI survey be different if we tried to specifically account for the migrant experience in the country? As you know, when we first started the PAPI survey, we originally sampled at the village level from household residency lists, what's known as the HOHO. But we had some concerns that because of that, we were missing out on the experience of a large number of migrants, because as you can imagine, those who had left a province weren't there to answer it, but when we went to the recipient provinces, we weren't capturing them because they weren't on the permanent residency list. In this project, we dealt with that for some critically important reasons. Now, to give you some context for the findings, the big thing I think, as a lot of you know, is that internal migration has increased dramatically in the past few years, along with Vietnam's economic development. As certain areas have become industrial or tourist or service sector hotbeds, they've become very attractive for migrants seeking to improve their livelihoods, seek better public service delivery. And to give you a sense of this, they're obviously Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi attract a large amount of migrants, but Binh Duong, which is quite a small province, has actually had a massive increase in its population over the past few years. The share of inflowing migrants as opposed to external migrants in Binh Duong is about 200%. And on top of that, because of migration, 1/5 of every current resident in Binh Duong is a recent migrant. So what this means for Binh Duong is that they have to expend a lot of activity thinking about how to cater to those migrants in terms of service delivery, health, infrastructure, education. And that requires both the attention of the government, but also it means that local residents have to adjust to the incoming migrants. A second big issue that's occurred over time is climate migration. This is going on all around the world, but it's something we've started to see in Vietnam. We've seen flooding in the central provinces, sea level rises, salination in the Mekong Delta. All of these have made traditional ways of life a little bit more difficult for certain migrants, for certain citizens, including fishing or agriculture. And because of that, either they or their children are seeking other opportunities in migrant recipient locations. And the final thing that means is that because of who these migrants are, it does mean how we understand the PAPI results are a little bit different. Migrants, as you might imagine, tend to be a little bit younger, tend to have less education and less experience with governance. So we wanted to explore that and see whether migrants' experience with governance was a little bit different from the permanent residents. So to do that, we altered our traditional sampling strategy a little bit. So as you know, we survey every province, but because of budget and logistical reasons, we can't survey every single village in Vietnam. So what we use is what's called a clustered sampling strategy, where we start quite high and then work our way down. And we do that using provincial proportion to size sampling. So for example, within each province, we select the capital district and then a few other districts that are randomly sampled but are weighted by their size. Then once we select those districts, then we use the same strategy for selecting communes and then select villages. Then when we get to the village level, traditionally what we've done is taken the household registration list of permanent residents, so what you might know as KT1 or KT2, and surveyed 20 villagers. What we did this year, but only as a pilot in the 6 sending locations, is to adjust our sampling so that we added in 6 sending places, once we sampled a certain set of villages, within a few villages, we selected 10 holders of KT3 or KT4 residency status. These are short-term residents. So these are non-permanent residents who are either short-term KT3 or long-term KT3 or short-term KT4. And then once we did that, we could compare them to the overall sample. To show you what that looked like a little bit, you can see here, we can compare the 809 residents, permanent residents in Hanoi to 21 non-permanent residents in Bingzhuang, 235 permanent residents to 59 non-permanent residents. Overall, we have about 308. Now, it's small compared to the overall PAPI sample size, but it is really interesting in an important way for us to compare these experiences. So the first question, of course, is are migrants different from permanent residents? And in fact, the results show very clearly they are. So you can see here on the top, we look at income and then some demographic characteristics and then education and connections. So the first thing to see is that migrants tend to be poorer. They have less household assets, lower income. They were interestingly more likely to have their income affected by COVID. Second, they tend to be more female. About 60% are female versus 56% of the permanent residents, and they are a lot younger. The average age of the migrants is about 40 years compared to 50 years for permanent residents. They're less educated, and they're also a lot less connected. Only about 3% are party members versus 10% in the permanent residents in those locations. So what does that mean for governance? Are migrants experiencing governance differently? So to deal with this question, we basically recreated the entire PAPI index. And so here I'm showing you the unweighted PAPI score, the overall index, which is the one that we show for all of the different provinces in the country. And you can see here, there's about a 2.5 point difference between scores for migrants. So if you can imagine, about migrants rate about 2.5 points lower, about 39.5 versus 42 points for permanent residents. That's a pretty big gap. That would be, if we were to look, this would be a jump of about close would move someone up from a medium ranked locality to a relatively high ranked locality. When you look more deeply at how migrants experience governance, it's specifically in areas of transparency, participation, and control of corruption. They do receive public services, and they don't rate environment or e-governance very differently, but it is in those more traditional forms of governance where there's a gap. As a result, they also rank local governance performance a little bit lower. About 80% are satisfied versus 82% for non-permanent residents. And finally, that gap varies across locality. So you can see very clearly here, we do the same score for each of the different locations, create an unweighted PAPI score. And you can see that in Bac Ninh province, the difference between migrants is close to 5.5 points, that migrants are much more dissatisfied with governance than permanent residents. Whereas Da Nang, there's hardly a gap at all. It's only about 1.5 points. So the experience with migrants is actually much better and much closer to the traditional permanent resident. So you can see already just some wide differences in how provinces interact and treat migrants as close to their overall population. So what's driving this overall migration? So here we return to the full sample of 14,732 PAPI respondents. the first thing we did is we looked at which places in Vietnam migrants were most likely to say they would want to move to another location. And unsurprisingly, you can see it tends to be rural areas in the Central Highlands, Northwest Mountains, or Mekong Delta are places where people would be more likely to be able to seek opportunities to move. Urban centers like Can Tho or Ho Chi Minh City, there's much less desire there. Where would they like to go? Well, of course, the big cities, Ho Chi Minh City, Hanoi, but also places that are known for creating jobs, Binh Duong, Dong Nai, Hai Duong, where there's some industrial sites that they can move to. One particularly interesting location is Lam Dong province, which is the home of Dalat, which tends to be a magnet for migrants. Tend to be a magnet for migrants from the Central Highlands. We also asked migrants the reason for wanting to move. And the number one overall, though it varies a little bit by location, is family reunification, that they have family members there. And so it's easier for them to start their lives and get access to public services. Second is better jobs. This is very popular in Ho Chi Minh City and Binh Duong. And third, better natural environment. So Lam Dong does really well here as being a place that's thought to be clean and people want to move to. Now, I should stress that these aren't mutually exclusive, right? It's possible that because people have family there, it's easier for them to get jobs or access public services. And so these are connected, kind of, they're connected a little bit. What we do know is that those who are moving for family reasons are probably a little bit more risk averse than those who are moving for other reasons. So looking at the different characteristics of the biggest drivers. So as I said, the strongest factor in willingness to move is having family outside the province. Men are more likely than women to want to move in our survey, but remember, migrants tend to be more proportionally female. But men are more likely to move even without the backdrop of family opportunities to move. By contrast, older people tend to look for families, and those who have a child tend to look for families. Those are the biggest drivers, and that those who have a family might be looking for educational opportunities. In particular, we took a look at climate migration. This was a survey experiment where we provided people with information about climate change. So one group didn't get any information at all. A second group learned about sea level rising in Vietnam. A third group learned about sea level rising and also had a map provided about particular climate change locations and areas where climate change was most likely to be felt. And then we also introduced them to an official who doubted climate change to see if that changed their behavior in terms of how they read the information versus an official. So the big thing that's important is once people learned about potential climate change information, the willingness to migrate shifted from 7.6% in that control group to 12.3%. Receiving the map moved them up a little bit to 12.8%. When they were exposed to a doubting official, that led to a decline, but not a significant decline, only down just about 2 points to 10.8%. And then finally, when they received all of the information, sea level rise map and a doubting official, they were about 13.2%. So the bottom line is that learning about climate change has made people more likely to move. And it's something to keep in mind when we think about Vietnam's future development is climate change is an important driver in how people are starting to think, and it will be a larger driver as climate change starts to become more salient in Vietnam. So key findings that I want you to remember from this study is that there are significant demographic differences between migrants. They tend to be poorer, less educated, more female, and less connected to party and government officials. They experience worse governance, and that gap varies heavily across provinces, especially in areas of participation and accountability. Most people who express a desire to move want to stay within Vietnam, and climate change does matter for their decisions. So I think that the big implications are that from a governance perspective, migrant receiving provinces are going to need to double their efforts to deal with the expectations of both permanent and non-permanent residents. And it's definitely time to rethink the permanent residency status in terms of access to public services, given the wide sale that's going on. And then finally, clarity of information and transparency is really critical. People are making very strategic decisions, and information is both important for citizens and leaders to make correct leaders about decisions to take this big risk of moving yourself and your family to new locations. Finally, let's move to the last analysis, which is the gender in the 2021 elections. As in previous years, what we did this year, because it was an election year, was we exposed people. We basically, like a video game, we randomly created different types of delegates, and we asked people who they would like to vote for as their candidate in the National Assembly. We also did it again for village leaders. One thing that we were interested in is how female candidates did versus male candidates. Now, both for their National Assembly delegate and for their village leader, there was a gap, but the gap was significantly different. People were more likely to vote for women, about 49% of the time, for their National Assembly delegate, as opposed to their village leader. There, the gap was much more significant. About a 4.6% difference from the male candidate. There's a bunch of reasons for this. One, people know that the National Assembly encourages female participation. There's also questions about who people want as an executive versus a legislative representative, because particular skills that are associated with gender might be important in those different roles. A really interesting finding from this year's study is that women face a penalty that men don't have for having children. As you can see, male and female candidates are evaluated pretty similarly when they're unmarried. And when they're married with children, the gap grows a little bit. But the gap grows quite big when we get to the notion of married and has 1 or 2 children. People are much less likely to vote for female versus male candidates the more children they have. And this has to do with gender roles and ideas about who should be in the House. And it is something that probably we should think about when it comes to selecting leaders, because people with children have experiences that would be important for crafting legislation and running villages. A final thing we looked at is, what are citizens voting for? And we asked them, are you more likely to vote for delegates who say that they want to benefit citizens, benefit the state as a whole, the overall country, or want to benefit business? And delegates who said that their primary goal was to represent citizen interests were significantly more likely than the other groups, about 52%, to be selected, all else equal, than those that said they wanted to benefit the nation or businesses. Businesses was significantly lower than the other two. Okay, to sum it all up, voters prefer men over women candidates, but particularly for executive offices at the local level, like the village level. Voters prefer candidates with families overall, but they tend to punish women candidates that the larger their family gets. And voters prefer candidates that focus on citizen concerns instead of the concerns of the business or the state, though the state is above business, but citizen concerns, representation matters a lot. So what does this come out of it? Well, one thing is we may want to rethink quotas, especially rethink Vietnam's gender quota and allow more females to be represented. So that they, and especially there might be some work to do about talking the specific things that women with families can bring to the debate. More work is definitely needed to have more women as village heads. There appears to be more of a gender bias at that level. And then finally, this is something that I'm particularly interested in, which is candidate orientation. For a long time, both the Vietnamese party and the government have done a lot to try and make delegates more responsive and give them more information about what citizens want. And now we can also see that citizens prefer delegates who are representing their interests. And what does that mean for policy? Well, it means that it would be very useful to improve voter-delegate communication so that delegates are more aware of what their citizens want and can act on that when they're representing them in the National Assembly. Thank you. It's been a real great pleasure to be able to share these really interesting findings with you, and I hope to talk with you more about them in the Q&A. Thank you very much.